had a good tour of Merton. So we have two papers this afternoon. And the first one is going to be given by Beppe Pezzini, who is, of course, one of the co-organizers of the conference, and we have a lot to thank him for. Beppe is a tutor and fellow at Corpus, where he teaches Latin philology and the ancient theory of fiction. And for the purposes of today, he's also about to produce, it's coming out soon, a monograph on Tolkien and the mystery of literary creation. Thank you very much.
Good. I hope you have the handout, which I gave you yesterday. Do you have a copy of the handout? No. Can you copy of the handouts? We are very welcome. We are very happy to have opened the questions that always last day. We have moved. We need to thank the college for the great hospitality. Very much. Good. So today I will give a contribution to two different but related fields of research which have been burgeoning in the past few years, the past decade, I would say. And I will introduce my paper, say a few things about these two fields of research. Number one on the handout is the research on the classical reception in English poetry in the First World War. This received a great boost in the last decade, especially thanks to the publication in 2010 of Elizabeth Vandiver's book. You see there the cover, Stand in the Trench Achilles, Classical Receptions in British Poetry of the Grey War. As I said, that was published in 2010 by OUP, and in a way this was seminal in many respects. A lot of things have been published since then, a lot of projects have been initiated. I will mention just one, led by a colleague of mine in this very college, Stephen Harrison, who is co-producing a full-scale classical reception commentary on the poets, English poets of the First World War. The name of G.B. Smith is not found, in fact, in Vandiver's books. I checked, but she openly acknowledges at the beginning that she only skimmed through a very small selection of the more than 2,000 English poets collected in what is instead the authority bibliography of poets of the First World War by Catherine Rayleigh. This is a big book with more than 2,000 names in it, and she only focused on 400 of them, a small and somehow random selection, as she openly acknowledges. So the fact that Smith is not there doesn't necessarily mean that Smith is not important as regards classical receptions. It's quite clear that classical reception is very important to understand the poets of the First World War. In all the poems selected by Vandiver, we see how the poets engage with the classical tradition in different ways, but there is something which is similar. This is to say, they approach it as a source of imaginative inspiration. They refer to it to try to understand and describe their experience in the war through the shared set of classical models. Classical tradition is not the only one, as we know also from Grace's research, but certainly classical tradition is a very important way these poets, these soldiers were trying to understand what was going on to their lives at the beginning of the 20th century. In engaging with doing so, these poets were engaging in a shared cultural memory. Then it's a memory which in a way was rooted in their experience in the public and grammar schools of England. I was talking to Stuart before, we didn't have anything of the sort in Italy at the time. This also explains why we don't really have war poetry in Italian for the First World War. We have folk music, but no war poetry. And I think one of the reasons why is because we did not have a system of public and grammar schools, I would say. So this memory was rooted in that experience, the shared experience of school, but more generally was related to something broader what was going on in the late Victorian age, in late Victorian culture as a whole. As Vandiver says in an introduction, I quote, classes in the early 20th century British society as a whole was a vital source of shared discourse in British wartime culture across classes, publishing venues, political positions, and literary style. Classical tradition had this power to, if you want, crisscross different classes and different political positions. Among the most common patterns of this shared discourse, I can refer, for instance, and you can see there on the handout, to the use of anti-barbarian narratives to justify the war against anti-civilized Germany, or to the other tropes of Homeric heroism, or the idea of a good death as a blueprint to describe or even justify the sacrifice of the English volunteer at the beginning of the war.
And more generally, I find this even more interesting, the anchoring of contemporary events on a sort of idealized mythical picture of ancient Greece, especially with the aim to immortalize the life and the death of the British soldier. I'll give you an example on the handout. You can see here that's a poem from Roger Quinn dedicated to the memory of Robert Sterling, who is a poet on whom we'll come back later on. And again, we don't have the time to read it all, but it's quite clear how the death of this young poet is given a meaning, if you want, to an anchorage on the classical tradition. From a different viewpoint instead, and we also find a bit of that, we find poets referring to classical patterns of tragic fatalism, which are evoked to mourn and even accuse, if you want, the senseless slaughter of the generation. There is one idea in particular which I found quite often, the idea of hating the gods. And the gods here are the gods of Troy, if you want, the gods sending the youth to die on the plain of Troy, and Troy is a very pervasive presence in the war poetry. So hating the gods, if you want, is the hate, the senseless forces that dominate history and then have engendered the war. Both these two modes, if you want, of opposite reception are found in the poetry of G.B. Smith, as we're going to see later on. The second, if you want, field of research I will be contributing to, which again has been burgeoning in the past few years, is that on the relationship between Tolkien and the classics. I think 5-6 books have been published in the past 3 years only, either collected volumes, edited volumes, or monographs. Dimitris himself here has edited a book in Greek, collecting research on Tolkien and the classics. I think this broadening of scope is very good for Tolkien studies. For a long while, I would say the Quellenforschung, the reception of the study of the sources of Tolkien was somehow monopolized by the medievalists. Pretty sure this is very important, and we all love the medievalists, but Tolkien was a bit more than that, okay? And for instance, the father of Lucia Simonson, who will be speaking later, has written a very important book showing how versed Tolkien was in modern literature and how much he engaged with the romantic novel, the romantic poetry, or the realistic novel, or modernist poetry. One thing that he told me that really struck me, for instance, is that when the hobbits arrived to Bree, okay, that's a sort of a rewriting of a passage from Dickens, from Charles Dickens. There is a lot of literature you would not expect in The Lord of the Rings. So it's, in a sense, Tolkien was a medievalist, he was a noble philologist, but he was also a romantic, he was a symbolist, he was a modernist, and also he was a classicist. And I think this last epithet is particularly appropriate for him because he did study classics. He studied classics at school, at Kierkegaard School, which was one of the top grammar schools of the time. And I can tell you, as a teacher of Latin in this college, that the kind of what they did at that time in Kierkegaard School cannot be compared with what we're asking our students nowadays. So certainly, even just by attending the school, he did a classicist stricto sensu. He then, at school, as we heard yesterday, he loved performing ancient Greek plays. He excelled in Latin competitions, to the point, in fact, that it was not surprising that he decided to apply to study classics at Oxford. He applied to this very college, Corpus Christi. He did not pass the examination, in fact, because the last 2 years of school, he was, let's say, thinking about something else. And so he did not pass the exam. He came back the following year, he went to Exeter, but he did in 1913 sat the Oxford Mods examination, which I can tell you, I've made a research, was by far the most difficult classics exam in the world at that time. And even after he converted to Anglo-Saxon literature in his third year and moved from classes to English, the newborn English degree in Oxford, he continued to be very well aware of his classical background, his classical training, and in fact, especially in later letters, he will explicitly acknowledge analogies or influences of classical text on his narrative. For instance, he will talk about, he will refer to the Homeric catalogue before the siege of Minas Tirith, if you remember the scene. He will talk about the fall of Numenor as an Atlantis-like fall. He will talk about the decline of the Numenorians from a Homeric state to a situation similar to that of the late Roman Empire, eventually declining the Byzantine state of Gondor. Gondor is Byzantium. There is even a map at the Bodleian Library a few years ago, when it was quite clear that that's the way Gondor was supposed to be. There are many other classical resonances in Tolkien's work, normally unacknowledged and blurred with other influences, but they are not less meaningful and important for the understanding of what's going on in the text. Certainly in Tolkien's work, the classical ingredient is hidden, is implicit. To use the famous Tolkien's analogy, the ingredient of the soup has been fully dissolved into the broth, so you don't feel the texture any longer. That's not exactly the case in his early works, and it is certainly not the case in, to come finally to the topic of my paper, to Smith's Spring Harvest, where the texture of the classical ingredient in the soup is very clear. You need to manage it, and it's not dissolved at all, as it will be in Tolkien. So what I'm going to do in the next section, let me try to go forward, is to give you a short overview of the classical ingredient in G.B. Smith's Spring Harvest. This is a collection where we do find clearly a clear influence of the classicism of Tennyson and others, not just Tennyson. We do find Keats, we do find Yeats, but we also find Tennyson and other classicism poets of the 19th century. I don't have a lot of time, so I will focus on 5 poems in particular, where the classical patina is most clearly acknowledged. These are the 5 poems you find there. All of them have a Latin title: Aere Perennius, Domum Redim Poeta, Area Truvale, Creator Spiritus, Anglia Valden Senectute, plus another 2 which I will mention later on. The first poem, Aere Perennius, this is a quote from a poem by Horace, which you find there. That's poem 330. It's the poem placed at the end of a Horace collection, and it's a very, very famous and influential declaration of poetic immortality. My poetry will become immortal. I have finished a monument which will be more lasting than bronze. That's what Aere Perennius means. This theme of the immortality of poetry is key in Smith's collection. Of course, it's very traditional. There is nothing original, but what I think is interesting is that this is clearly anchored on a classical model from the very beginning. Let me read just a few lines. The song that one alone has sung, the great uncompromising page, all are these but glittering bubbles flung upon the world from age to age. Jump a bit, rather, they shine as doth the star. Think already about the idea that the poets are immortal like the star. I'll come back on this later on, about the close of winter's day that cheers the traveling afar and dorsey moment points the way. Another important imagery in Smith, which we already discussed this morning, the imagery of sailing. Poetry and sailing somehow come together in Smith. So this poem epitomizes, in fact, these 2 related themes, which I think are really crucial to understand what Smith was trying to do before the First World War. The first theme, the immortalizing power of poetry. Poetry is a sort of gateway between the mortal world and the eternal world. I agree with what was said yesterday. I don't think there's any religious affiliation here. This is very aestheticist, it's very classical, it's very romantic as well. Okay, you can really see how, in a way, what Smith was doing was very well embedded in the cultural discourses of his time. There is also the idea, which I quite like as an image, as a specific image of a communion of poets. Quite often there is the idea that all the poets come together into a single line, a bit like in Dante's Divine Comedy. There is a place where all the poets come together, and in a way the poet with this work is kind of crossing the display of mortality and joining the club, if you want. We see the same idea in another poem which was mentioned yesterday, To an Elzevir Cicero, which in fact essentially is a declaration again of the immortality of poetry, because the voice which is preserved by this book does not change with the changing of the years. But since we already talked about this poem yesterday, I will not say more on this. If in these 2 cases we have seen how the classical tradition is evoked to either a quote or an explicit address to a copy of an ancient text, in another poem, and more than one, we see a different pattern of reception. We have the poem by Smith, which is clearly modeled on an ancient text. That's the case of the second text I'm going to discuss, which is called Domum Redim Poeta. The first stanza in particular is almost a translation of another poem by Catullus, which is the poem you see here, which is Catullus 31. I think Catullus is the most important classical presence in Spring Harvest. Catullus was a poet from Verona, from northeast Italy, who died young. Love and exiles are some of the important themes of Catullus, but we see later on how Catullus is also evoked in a different way. What is also interesting in this poem is that the first stanza is clearly almost a translation or adaptation of poem 31 Catullus, whereas the second stanza is much more English, if you like, talking about the cat curl on the cozy earth or the thrushes in the garden trees. These are not exactly classical images, okay? Here we see how we have a bit of a blurring of the classical landscape or the classical traditional idea of return as we found in Catullus with an English one. Here I think we see perhaps what is the most important pattern of reception that we find in Smith. We mentioned this already in the previous section. And this is the fact that the classical source is not merely rehearsed in another language. This itself is an ancient classical pattern of reception, because Catullus himself was already doing the same with the Greek tradition of Sappho, for instance. So on the one hand, so I want just to stress that Smith does not simply rehearse or appropriate the classical material for something different, in a different context. I think to understand the pattern, the framework of the reception of Smith, which is the same of Tolkien, and I've written on this, I think we can quote an Platonic analogy, if you want. The way Smith addresses or approaches this classical material will be the same way, the same sort of relationship that there is between a Platonic idea and a material embodiment. There are a lot of different embodiments of the same idea. Catullus' embodiment, the idea in this case is the idea of a return home, and the same idea is embodied in Smith's experience, and therefore all of them are embodiments of a single idea. So they kind of, the first embodiment is quoted or referred to as an authoritative embodiment, but not as the only one. That explains why things can change. Tolkien will refer to this sort of relationship with the terminology motives and modes. The motive is something which is eternal, immortal, universal, and which is then embodied in different motives and different texts. That's the kind of theoretical terminology used by Tolkien in his letters, for instance, or in his essays. Of course, he's not the only one doing that, but I think it's quite clear that Smith shares the same theoretical framework. Another poem in which we find the shadow of Catullus, if you want, is poem Ave atque vale. You see in this here. This is we know that there is Catullus here because the phrase Ave atque vale is the ending of another poem of Catullus, very famous, which is poem 101. I'll briefly read a few lines because I think it's very beautiful. This is an elegy for the death of his brother, written on Troy, in the land of Troy. I already mentioned that Troy is a very important presence in First World War poetry. Troy is a bit everywhere, not also because of the campaign to Gallipoli. Going to Gallipoli, in a sense, had almost justified the use of the antonomasia of Troy to refer to the idea of war. I just briefly read Catullus' text. Having been carried through many nations and over many seas, that's the beginning of Catullus 101. A quotation from the Odyssey, by chance. That's really an allusion to the beginning of the Odyssey. You see how the classical poets were doing the same, referring back to the Odyssey to frame what Catullus is doing here. He's on exile, he's traveling in distant lands far from home. So I arrive, brother, for these wretched funeral rites, so they may present you with the last tribute of death, a speaking vain silent ash, since fortune has taken you yourself away from me. And then at the end, we say, receive these rites, dripping with much brotherly blood, and forever, brother, hail and farewell, ave atque vale. Why Smith names this poem Ave atque vale? In a sense, this is a very different poem, different content, different context. That's a love poem, a farewell poem to the city of Oxford, the immortal city of Oxford, evermore the same. And we may say, okay, it's just using the title to say farewell to Oxford. There is no more than that. And yet, I think we can read much more than that, because it's quite clear to me, at least, by anchoring this poem on Catullus 101. Ave atque vale is not a standard Latin phrase. It's found only once in the literature, that particular poem, so it's not referring to anything else. He's sort of alluding to the real theme of this poem. The real theme of this poem is not just an apology of the mortality of Oxford, but it's more, if you were more deeply, a prophecy of what's going to happen to him, or at least the way he felt at this time. We perceive, in fact, that there is something weird. I mean, there is, you can see how the Catullan allusion is also confirmed by the reference to the grave dust and the silence, the silent ashes. You can see the setting is very similar, even if then the mood changes very quickly. We don't know exactly, therefore, where Smith is going in this poem, but through the Catullan intertext, we can guess it. Smith is going to war, just like Catullus went to Troy, just like his brother died at Troy. We see how Smith is leaving Oxford to go to war. That's something which we are not told explicitly, but it's evoked through the classical allusion. There is also another interesting classical motive in this poem, which we find, which is the image we find in the second stanza. The wind gives chase to relic leaves. As we had today, this morning, there are many, many different leaves in spring harvest. It's quite clear how Smith was a bit obsessed with the metaphor of human life as a leaf scattered by the wind. We find it everywhere in a lot of different poems. This is, of course, a very productive metaphor in the history of Western tradition, but he has an archetype. And the archetype is found here. The archetype is found here. The archetype is Homer, Iliad 6, 146, 149. So there is a missing, the number of the book is missing. That's the first time in the history of Western literature where we find this image. Men come and go as leaves year by year upon trees. Those of autumn the wind sheds upon the ground, and so forth. The same image is also found in Virgil, Aeneid 6, and I checked what both Smith and what Tolkien was reading, Smith were reading at school, and of course, Aeneid 6 and Iliad 6 were in the curriculum. These are very standard books to read for a young British man at the beginning of the 20th century. As I said before, this image, this metaphor is very productive. This simile metaphor, depending on the context, is very productive. I've given you a few examples from Song of the Downs, from Poor Virginia. It's found really a bit everywhere. It's found especially in this poem. A good example is in the poem called Songs of the Downs, where we also have another example of classical tradition. That's a poem set in the Oxford countryside, next to the ruins of a Roman road, in a very picturesque, romantic landscape. Very typical. If you remember the typical, not just romantic, but even in late 17th century, to write poems next to the ruins of the ancient past. It's very traditional, and it is related to another very romantic trope, the idea of heartbreaking nostalgia for the lost past. So this image of the fallen leaves scattered by the wind has also another classical affiliation to this picturesque context in this particular poem. Of course, the idea of fallen leaves is not just Smithian, it's also key in Tolkien. There is one poem in particular in Tolkien which has been construed by Tom Shippey as an intertext of Songs of the Downs, that is to say, the very famous poem of Galadriel. I sang of leaves of gold, and leaves of gold that grew, of wind I sang, a wind that came and in the branches blew. And then there are a few other examples of this. Whether this can be considered intertext or not, I'm not sure, but what is clearly similar in the two poets is this very classicizing idea of a heartbreaking nostalgia for a vanished past, which, as we know from Tolkien's letters, was the emotion you could evoke with the greatest ease. I cannot delve too much on this, but it's quite clear how we wouldn't understand Tolkien if we don't understand the provenance of this idea of the vanished past, which is quite often associated with this Homeric image of the fallen leaves. What I also find fascinating is that, of course, the theme of vanishing past and the nostalgia in Tolkien is not found everywhere. Okay, it is especially associated with and focalized to the elves. It is they are the elves, the ones that are kind of doomed to feel this sense. With this, I think this kind of focalization is very important. To a certain extent, I would argue that the elves somehow embody the romantic aestheticist approach to literature and poetry that we also find in Smith. To a certain extent, Smith was an elf, if we may say so. Quite closely related to the image of the leaves, there is the image of the wind, another image we've already introduced, and especially a wind from the west, a wind from the sea. I won't say too much on this, as Alan already said plenty this morning. I just want to stress one important thing, that this wind is something that scatters the leaves, just like divine force in the Homeric tradition, but it also wind which the mariners used to sail. There's one poem in particular, which is another Latin poem, the Creator Spiritus, where we have the two options. We see we are scattered far like autumn leaves. That's one approach to the wind, or proudly sail like ships at sea. The same in the opening stanza. The wind that scatters dying leaves and wisdom from the autumn tree is grateful to the ship that cleaves with steady prow the scarring sea. Here we see two different attitudes to the violence of history, the violence of time, if you want. Either you are scattered away by the wind, or you sail into the wind. And if we think about Tolkien here, the idea of a wind blowing from the west, more specifically an eternal line of other seas, which is the way the wind is presented in Smith, it's difficult for us not to think about Tolkien, where indeed we know that the wind is a divine force under the power of a Valar, under the power of a god. This is to say Manwë, and in the Silmarillion, but also the Lord of the Rings, whenever there is a wind blowing, we can reconstruct somehow the intervention of the hidden gods. This idea of a wind from the never-resting sea, the voice of the old gods that blows from the far isle where there is no change of season, where there is plenty no man's south, all these ideas are clearly classical. They are Smithian and Tolkienian, but first of all, they're classical. The idea that wind is a divine force, of course, is Homeric and Greek and mythological in general. Also, the idea of a prison, of a mortal reality, which is somehow touched by an immortal wind. Again, that's also very classical. It's found in Plato's cave myth, for instance, okay, with the same sort of imagery. The idea of the island of the blessed on the west, that's a classical trope. It's been appropriated by the Celtic mythology, especially Irish mythology, mediated rather than appropriated. But whenever we think about the islands of the blessed, it's not impossible at the end of the day to go back to ancient mythology. Another very clear classical trope is the Golden Age myth. This, you see, the land where there is plenty no man's south is almost a quotation to a passage from Hesiod Erga, which is the archetypical foundation of the myth of the Golden Age. The grain-giving field bore crops on its own accord, much and unstinting. What is the Golden Age? The Golden Age of our past that everyone has is the moment of our life, of human life, where we did not have to work, and there was this sort of immediate relationship between nature and human beings. I just quote a final poem where we see the same idea of the wind, of the leaves in the wind, and we also have the same idea of the sailing. Very briefly, I read from Darkest the Road Our Fathers Left Us. There is the same Golden Age motif. Time was when Earth was always golden, the Golden Age. Time was when skies were always clear. Spirits and souls of the heroes olden, who live, if you want to, kind of the ghost we were talking about this morning, tear you the veil of time asunder. It is the God's command. At this point, we see this idea that there is a veil separating this golden, immortal land from our mortal land, and we need to tear the veil. The poet is the one who is able to tear the veil and pass from one stage to the other. Of course, this is another typical Tolkienian imagery. If you think about the travels of Eärendil, the travels of Frodo and Bilbo at the end, but also in a fairy tale sense, the journey of Smith of Watermire is very similar. That's a typical conception of fame. What I also find interesting, and we conclude with this, is that this relationship with this god and land can be presented in somehow positive terms. Erendil is to a certain extent invited to travel. Bilbo is to a certain extent invited to embark on a journey. But there is also a way which is journey west, this travel into the wind is not exactly completely positive. The relationship is a bit problematic. This is very clear, for instance, in the poem that was quoted this morning by Stuart, another of the Latinate poems in the collection, Anglia Valdi Senectute, where we have another very romantic topic, which is the topic of Titanism. Since we first hear, it's interesting here, Smith is describing the declaration of war, how he frames the Britain declaration of war against Germany. Since first we flung our gauntlets to the skies, and there the high gods will to bend, our fires, the steel may burn, the city lies burn unconsumed unto the end. This idea of to fling our gauntlet to the skies is clear anchored on that idea of Titanism. I gave you an image there where we have the first Titan who did so in a way which is Prometheus, another classical theme, super productive in romantic literature, and in a way traceable also this very poem. We have we find this theme of Titanism a bit everywhere in World War I poetry, not just in G.B. Smith. I'll give you another example from an unknown poet, where we have some sort of idea describing, in fact, the attack at Gallipoli. Not all the gods in heaven's miraculous panoply could have hindered or stayed them. Them are the British soldiers. So the British soldiers invading Gallipoli there, or invading or fighting against the Germans, are like the Titans fighting against the gods. Do we find something similar in Tolkien? Of course, yes. We have at least two, if not more, examples where we trace, especially in the early drafts, the same Titanic idea. The Fire of Feanor, the Nodos's Flight, the Speech of Feanor is clearly anchored on the tradition of a Titanomachy. He's fighting against the gods, he's disobeying, rebelling against the gods to embark on a travel and bring war somewhere else. But also in the case of the Númenor rebellion, when they go and sail west, again, they sail into the wind, against the wind. I don't have the time to read this very carefully, but we can really see how the same classical topic we saw in that poem of Smith is also used in Tolkien. I will finish here, just to find a couple of minutes. I will briefly mention a poem which is my favorite poem. I won't have the time to read it today, but I want just to say that, in a sense, all the themes that I've discussed in my short paper are found eventually in what is Smith's magnum opus, The Burial of Sophocles. The Burial of Sophocles was a poem he composed in 1914 for the Oxford Newdigate Prize, which he didn't win. He went to another one, Robert Sterling, the one I mentioned at the beginning, who did write A Burial of Sophocles, which won the prize. But it was clear the poem that really Smith was really fond of. He wrote it, and he lost it, so he had to rewrite it again, then he left it Tolkien. This poem is clearly the most classical one, because it's derived from a passage of an ancient life of the poet Sophocles. Sophocles' burial during a war, again, and a burial which is only possible because of a dream sent by the gods to the general of the Spartans. So even the setting itself is already quite intriguing. It is a poem in which we do find in particular the same motif of traveling west. This poem is supposed to be very classical. The first section in particular, in a sense, is an emphasis of what I put to you there, the apotheosis of Homer, a very famous relief now kept in the British Museum, where we have Homer accompanied by the gods and all the other great immortal poets into his apotheosis. First section is basically this applied to Sophocles, with the same typically Smithian idea of the leaves that leave the earth and the wind that blows. So we do find the same ideas. The second section, however, is even more interesting. The second section is the journey of Sophocles. And here we can see how what we heard today from Chris Wonk clearly is the subtext to understand what goes on. This classical idea becomes, it clearly becomes Irish, Celtic, early medieval journey west. And we, as I already mentioned this morning, I do find even a formal confirmation. The meter use is very peculiar, and it's quite typical of Anglo-Norman poetry, and in fact was one, well, not first because there were other instances, but one of the most famous use of this particular meter was indeed the Voyage of St. Brendan. I do find a lot of similarities between this poem and the Tale of Eärendil. Some of them are really intertextual. The general idea of traveling west to the end of the world, looking for some sort of paradise, well, it's basically what Eärendil is doing, of course, appropriated and changed into Tolkien's mythology. But I think that's quite interesting intertextual connection, which I've underlined here. Also, I just need a couple of lines to understand how non-classical this supposed classical journey is. This is the journey of Sophocles going to see the gods on the Mount Olympus, receiving from them a poetic investiture. But first of all, he set sail. Sophocles setting sail is a bit strange. Mount Olympus, you don't need to sail to get to Olympus, to be honest. When the white ship of the moon, the ship of the moon is a phrase used by Tolkien again and again in his mythology. A mania rune was written in the Argent stars, and his feet were set towards the hills because he knew that there the hills ran down like jewels, and fairy cars galloped maybe among the dells, and airy sprites were fitful spells. That's not a classical place. That's not a classical locus amenus. This is indeed an Irish, Celtic otherworld, which in fact is even able to the formal features. Final section of this poem, I do think, again, we see how many connections there are with the Tale of Eärendil. The last section of the poem is a catasterism. Sophocles has become a star, the brightest stars of all, the ageless non-parallel stars, the light beyond the prison bars. And if you think about how Eärendil is described on his arrival on Valinor, or how the star, we don't know, we're not sure that it's Eärendil, but how the star seen by Frodo and Bilbo, by Sam, Frodo and Sam, is described in a very similar way. Sophocles has become a star, just star. Of course, the context is completely different. The classical trophy of catasterism, which is of course itself a classical trophy, does no longer have the kind of aesthetic intellectualism typical of Smith, has become something different, but to a certain extent has been completed. In a way, I do think that in a way Tolkien's work completed the spring harvest of G.B. Smith. And I will conclude on another very intriguing intertextual similarity on the final stanza. The final stanza is a praise of the old age of Sophocles. Sophocles was notorious in antiquity for having died very, very, very old. A bit the opposite of the kind of expectation that the gods loved the youth, which was repeated again and again at the beginning of the century, almost to justify the glorious death of the British volunteer. In this case, the poet, the mortal poet, dies very, very, very old. And they're very intrigued, especially by the last few lines, where we have, you can see a very similar, there are many similarities with Bilbo's final song, the final journey. They're not just in the meter, again, the same, not exactly the same, but a very, very similar meter, and a few intertextual connections there. I do think that whether consciously, whether unconsciously, in a sense, this motive of a journey west at the end of his age, reaching the land of the gods, reaching immortality in a different way, was somehow fulfilled in Tolkien's work. So that explains the title of my talk, Then We May Do the Things Undone. In a sense, we can see how, in a different way, the ways that were idiosyncratic and peculiar to Tolkien's own sensitivity, just like in Niggle's story, Niggle's most specific, more peculiar features are done in collaboration. We may say how in Tolkien's work, we see the traces of this collaboration that began many years before in his life. Thank you very much, because it's been too long. Thanks a lot. Just open Mark's presentation.
Thank you very much, Beppe. So, introducing our second speaker, Mark Atherton, who is a lecturer at Regent's Park and Mansfield, where he teaches Old and Middle English. Mark's recent book is he's published a textbook on Old English, but he's also just produced a prize-winning book on the Battle of Malden, poem which was mentioned earlier. But most appropriately for today, he is the author of There and Back Again, Tolkien and the Origins of the Hobbit.
Tolkien, if he hadn't written poems and become interested in mythology and had friends with Smith and Gilson and so on, and if he had simply just done his job, he would have been famous for one piece of writing only, probably. We still use it. It's a lecture he gave on Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. It contains an allegory. I mean, Tolkien is famed for not liking allegory, but that didn't stop him from using allegory in his critical writings. And the allegory he used was one of a tower that was built by a man, and then in later, the archaeologists, I suppose, they're the critics, they came along and they say, oh, it's a very interesting tower. Let's examine how it was put together. So they knock it down and it's just a pile of stones, and then they examine each stone. And then they say, oh, it's a pity he didn't use some other kinds of stones when he built this tower. And they didn't bother to actually climb the tower and see the view of the sea from the top of the tower. In a way, I'm slightly worried I'm going to do the same with one of G.B. Smith's poems, because I'm going to focus mainly on one poem. My aim is to do a kind of close reading of that poem, looking at what it's made up of. I want you to be involved, so I'm going to kind of turn it into a sort of 3-minute workshop in the middle, if you'll go along with me. And basically you need the handout on which the poem is reproduced, complete with line numbers, just as I would do for my students. And you will have to go through looking for certain images at the appropriate moments. But give me 5 minutes to introduce the poem before we get on to that. And my question at the end then is, what is this poem about? What are the intertexts? What can we see in G.B. Smith's poem that reflects, that shows influence of Tolkien? Is it a kind of allegory? That's the sort of question to bear in mind. So looking at it for a start, thinking first of all about one or two images in it, the mood of it. There's a tower involved, another of the many towers that we find in Tolkien's writings, of course. There's a tower, it's night, under the skies, there's clouds, a moon, a guard or sentry is calling the hours. There's a shadowy street down below, a wild, majestical, the wild, majestical wind, and the call of the sea. So it's some images, of course, that we've been seeing already in many of these papers. There's movement in this poem. Look at it, it's very often through the participles. Line 3, there's a flickering light from the candle. There are traced towers, scurrying, shuddering clouds. Line 11. Line 13, hurrying feet. Line 19, a great awakening breath. And then, of course, the sea again, line 24, breaking, murmuring. What he seems to be doing here is a rhythmical effect. I do want to look at the style as well of this poem, and the scurrying, shuddering. So the great awakening, the breaking, murmuring, these doublets that increase in size from 2 to 3 syllables, breaking, murmuring, this kind of effect that he's creating there. What about the setting for this poem? It's now your turn. I'd like you to go through this poem looking for any evidence that there is a medieval or perhaps romantic setting in this poem. Is there anything that tells us that this is not set in the modern world? of the 20th century. Is there anything in the style, archaic diction? Get out your pens, read through the poem for a couple of minutes, and then we'll see what we're coming up with. If you want to do it with the person sitting next to you, do go ahead. But pair work is often useful. I'm aware of the time going by, so this is a very, very short workshop. But Scholar Gray, this post-modifying adjective grey after the noun Scholar Gray sounds a rather archaic to me. Charactered pages suggests the manuscript. The tall candle, of course, the one tall candle. In a turret, we're back in this tower, but a turret chamber suggests something medieval. A scholar, learned, or I'm not even sure how to pronounce that, learned or learned. Learned is the older pronunciation. It still fits the rhythm to have both, but possibly learned. He certainly has traced towers. Learned in what? In grammary, this old word that developed in the late medieval period for grammar, and it's also related to the later development glamour. It suggests education in grammatica, in grammar, but also in other arts, perhaps even something magical about it as well. The rack, line 10, it's still there in the phrase rack and ruin, but it's wind-driven rack. It suggests again that there's something, it almost sounds a bit Anglo-Saxon as well with the alliteration. It fits exactly into the Siever's types of alliterative poetry in the Old English period, wind-driven rack. And there are one or two others like that. What about this line 15 and line 16? The flame of silvery steel in a perilous game. Perilous is not a word I use myself. It's very perilous to cross the road. No, dangerous. Perilous suggests to me something of the high medieval diction, a little bit archaic. We're kind of doing register here, aren't we? The trump that summons the saints from death. Yeah, for the trumpet, it's a biblical image of the apocalypse. The one I stumbled over, wild, majestical wind. I don't normally say majestical. I might say majestic, just occasionally. So we're getting a lot of a lot. Well, not a lot, but enough to suggest it's basically it's not deliberately archaic in the same way as William Morris, but this is a medieval setting, some kind of scholar in a tower working away while the rest of the world is in upheaval. Let me read some of the poem to you, and we'll look then at some of the intertext. It's basically a 4-beat rhythm, but the number of unstressed syllables changes from line to line. It's basically in rhyming couplets. This is the form that it's in. We've got 5 stanzas. The final stanza is an extended one, which comes to the conclusion. O scholar grey with quiet eyes, reading the charactered pages bright, with one tall candle's flickering light in a turret chamber under the skies. O scholar learned in grammary, have you seen the manifold things I see? Have you seen the forms of traced towers, whence clamorous voices challenge the hours, gaunt tree branches, pitchy black against the long wind-driven rack of scurrying, shuddering clouds that race ever across the pale moon's face? Have you heard the tramp of hurrying feet there beneath in the shadowy street? Have you heard sharp cries and seen the flame of silvery steel in a perilous game for men to play, hid from the searching eyes of day? Have you heard the great awakening breath like trump that summons the saints from death, of the wild majestical wind which blows loud and splendid, that each man knows far, oh far away is the sea, breaking, murmuring, stark and free. All these things I hear and see, I, a scholar of grammary, all are written in ancient books, clear exactly, and he that looks finds the night and the changing sea, the years gone by and the years to be, he that searches with tireless eyes in a turret chamber under the skies. Passion and joy and sorrow and laughter, life and death and the things thereafter. There's the poem. What do we make of it? Can we find resonances? There are certainly resonances with other poems in the GBS Spring Harvest. I've put one or two on the back of the handout, on page 2 of the handout. The theme of grammary, the image of the tree. I do wonder sometimes, just in passing, about it was all in the Black Country. Is anyone here from the West Midlands? Rather suspect not. I'm from the north of England. I can't really do a West Midland accent, but I just wonder whether Smith, maybe not all the time, but he could switch into dialect. I don't think Tolkien could, but maybe Smith could. It was all in a black country, what time the sweet of the year should be. I don't know, that's about as close as I can get. But there's something about that spelling with a double E. The windy citadels and the wind crying of forgotten days, the fast-walled cities of the poem, A Preface for a Tale I Have Never Told. And what about the top of page 2, that poem, one came down from 7 hills. So someone arrives in a stricken town, talks with the men of the town in the marketplace. They have a dialogue about how to deal with the current crisis. And he promises, in religious terminology, that he will pray to the gods that the correct decision will be made. Where else do we get this? Let's think about Tolkien. What about the fall of Gondolin? The arrival of the great hero Tuor in the hidden city. His debate with King Turgon about how to deal with the menace. the decision to stay there, and eventually, of course, the very Battle of Somme-like attack on the city and the flight from the city. The beleaguered city idea, of course, reappears then in the Lord of the Rings in the Siege of Gondor. So, have we perhaps got some kind of allegory going on here? Let's go back to Rime, and I'll try and sum up what I think the poem is about. Perhaps it's clear, but let me spell it out anyway. So it seems like it's in 3 parts, and the speaker of the poem is addressing the scholar. The speaker of the poem seems to be the man of action, and the scholar is up in his tower. He's learned in grammar, but can he see the various things, the manifold things? What are they? The clamorous voices, the wind-driven clouds across the pale moon's feet. Can he hear? Have you heard the tramp of hurrying feet? This sense of panic within a city under siege. It reminds me of the siege of Gondor very much, or of Gondor. There beneath the shadowy street, have you heard the sharp cries? Seen the flame of silvery steel? The flame of silvery steel, is that a sword? It reminds me of the Old English kenning Hilda lay on the battle light, which represents a sword. I suppose it could be more modern as well, but given the context, perhaps not. A perilous game then for, have you heard the final trumpet and the wild majestical wind and the sea breaking, murmuring far away? Those are the things that he demands of this scholar, this man of action. And then we get the reply, the response. It's a dialogue, once again, about how to deal with the current crisis. All these things, the scholar says. Is this Tolkien replying to Smith? All these things I hear and see, I, a scholar of grammar, they're all in ancient books. The poem Beowulf, the ancient works of literature, they still have something to say, something to tell us. Passion and joy, sorrow and laughter, life and death, and the things thereafter, still have something to tell us in this time of crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. We've got a fair bit of time for questions. Yes, first of all, Grace.
I have a question for you, Mark. I was wondering, I was quite surprised to see reference to one of Smith's letters. And I was wondering,
so reference to?
Reference to B.
Okay, yeah.
Where he's talking about the sparrow parable. Yeah. And I was wondering, in this poem, I see a little bit of the idea of the medieval scribe and possibly a royal medieval scribe as well. And I'm wondering if Tolkien ever had conversations with Smith about things like King Alfred and his royal circle, or equivalents to that, and if some kind of discussion like that is maybe influencing parts of this that have this element of a medieval scribe historian writing who has access to different kinds of books, possibly religious and classical. I wonder if you see any connection there at all.
That's an interesting idea, is that because you think, did he talk about B? Did he talk about King Alfred? Did he talk with Smith about Old English verse and how it's structured? And I just wonder when you get these alliterative, rhythmical alliterative phrases that sound very similar to Tolkien's rhythmical alliterative phrases, which go back to Old English poetry. You get it in the Fall of Arthur. Arthur, the whole thing is written, in a meter that closely follows the rules of the meter of Beowulf, which is perhaps a little surprising given the subject matter, but it colours it in a different way. That poem, also, The Fall of Arthur, is full of allusions to the wind blowing over the sea. I think I counted 37 mentions of the wind, the flowing, blowing, scurrying, shuddering, similar kind of language to Smith's language in the Fall of Arthur. But we're back on the question we were talking about before, about the mythology that I was talking about. Did Tolkien and Smith discuss mythology? Did they discuss their own studies together? That's what undergraduates do.
It occurred to me that Smith, he came up to Oxford later, and by that time Tolkien probably transferred over to study philosophy and legalism. Maybe it was just the right time to have those kinds of conversations when we were both there.
But they could have had them in school as well, because Tolkien discovered Old English pretty early on and was reading all the primers and learning Gothic. And he knew the rules of the literature verse, I'm there had been plenty of opportunity for them to think about all this.
Yeah. In that letter, I think he specifically says it's your story, isn't he? It's your Anglo-Saxon sparrow. Yes.
Yes. Yeah, that's interesting.
Sorry, yes.
Yes. If one wants to look for parallels in Tolkien's works with this, I associate it's rather different, but it's somehow similar with the siege of Minas Tirith. When Denethor goes up into his tower, you see the flickering light from it. And also this phrase silvery steel. Silver steel was the first, I think, name that Tolkien had for mithril, and the guard in Minas Tirith had helmets of mithril, so there would have been flashes on those helmets in that siege as well.
I don't have any comment to that, but I find it very interesting.
Was it following up, John?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, John.
I mean, first of all, I find it unimaginable that they didn't discuss these things. And I think, given that we have no record of their conversations, that the knowledge that Smith is citing something that Tolkien has told him from his Anglo-Saxon studies, you could probably, I think, make a comparison with Tolkien's letters to his son Christopher. That they are conversant in similar things, and Tolkien keeps bringing out his own knowledge about medieval literature, religion, the classics, and so on. And I'm sure he would have been doing that as a young man too. They were together at Oxford for just over a year, very close to each other. And I'm sure they were doing more than hijacking buses in the time. And I don't know how well they knew each other prior to that.
Is that because of the age?
They seem to have hit it off when they appeared in The Rivals together.
It's a very short relationship.
It's short and intense. I mean, you think about undergraduate years, they're
Much shorter than every others.
Yeah, that's right. My other point is that I read this poem differently, and I'm not saying that I'm right. I could well be woefully wrong. But I see that, I see it as an internal dialogue of someone at Oxford. So you can feel when you are here that you are in a medieval city. The room that I've been kindly allowed to stay in looks out to the not quite a spire, but the chapel at Merton, and the tracery branches across it. And there's an alley down the passageway below my window. You can imagine. I don't want to reduce this to allegory, but let's imagine that he's writing this after the war's broken out, and you've got the officer training corps and their training rifle. Maybe I don't know if they would have trained with bayonets. Do you know?
They did practice training.
Yeah.
Did they run through the streets?
I must not run there.
In the fields.
A perilous game, but that whole trope of the war being a football match or whatever. And then he asks these questions, and he comes to the end, and he asks, well, I'm a scholar of grammar in the same position as this figure that I'm addressing centuries ago, and there's this continuity. ongoing. I see it myself. I'm in this turret chamber. I don't know if there are any turret chambers in this particular college, but
He was at Malta, he was still at it.
and
That
but
was a huge tower.
that's true.
Yeah, the lady should want to know.
And the trial that someone's the same as her again, I'm thinking about the other. But
Okay, well, there are two. Any other theories on answering this? No, you've just had two.
When I read the poem, the thing that stood out for me was the description of the wind in the sea. And it reminded me of the passage in the lament for Boromir, where you have to talk of the different winds.
Oh, yes, you do.
And he also talks of about wild wind coming. And there's also, I believe there's a line talking about riding over 7 streams in that.
Right.
Passing into land wide and grey until he passes away. But a similar depiction of someone riding through land and over stream is when Aragorn rides from the stone of earth to Pelegrin, and he's riding over the streams of Lebanon and comes into Pelegrin, which I believe is deserted. They've all fled from the Corsairs. So it's a similar, it kind of reminds me of that description.
Yes, so we've got any questions for Beppe?
Yes,
sir. And then I'll come to you. Yeah, sorry, lady then. Sorry.
Okay, right. Beppe, thank you very much for pointing out all of those classical allusions in Smith, far more than ever I saw myself. Similarly, far more than ever through your article in H. Room's book, I saw lots in Tolkien that I hadn't seen before. When we look at Smith's poetry, I just asked myself, what is the effect of these? Obviously, they must create some sort of literary effect in what they're doing. My impression is they do two things. One of them is that Latin is associated very much with school and university, and when Smith is using these, for example, he's addressing himself very much to Oxford. A poem published in the Oxford magazine, and it's tribal, if you like. He's naming the colleges one by one: Trinity, Merton, Warden, Oriel, Christ Church, and so on. This is a poem written to the faithful, if you like, the Oxford faithful. The other thing he does in the war poems, when he makes classical allusions, he is striking a classical pose. Very much so. Yeah. And very interested to see how he does it. Another poem, he has a different use for it. He is actually, whether he realized he was doing it or not, challenging a professor of classics. Because in the Songs and the Downs, this road the Romans made, this track half lost in the Green Hills, then he's clearly calling to mind any houseman on Wenlock Edge, the wood's in trouble, as far as fleece the reeking bees. He's challenging a professor of classics. Whether he wins the duel, I'm not quite sure, because, of course, Houseman's poem is much more complex. We have different sets of correspondences. We have got the commotion amongst the leaves, reflecting commotion in the human heart. We have got the passing of time, the leaves, and so on, and the idea that all of this will pass. Okay, to take the road for ashes under Uricon.
Thank you, Alan. So this is a complex question because it goes to the core of the current crisis that we have in classes at the moment. So I don't know if you're aware of it, but in the 21st century, there's a kind of crisis in the whole world going on. What's the purpose of classes? Okay, so this is your question about why does Smith flaunt his classical
I would never question the use of classics. My first teaching job was teaching Latin.
And you see, this is a question that says it goes to the core. Why do we study classics? And there are many departments in the US, I was talking to a friend just last week, and colleagues in the US that are kind of suggesting that they wish all the departments of classics in the US should close down, and there should be some sort of multicultural departments, okay? So if we go back at the beginning of the 20th century, if we think about the 19th century, classics, of course, has a lot to do with school education. It's in a way, it's a form of identity. So, yeah, classics means to join the club somehow, which is the club of grammar schools, public schools. So there's a social, cultural identity process going on there, which I think is important. But more deeply than that, and in a way, we're going into the core of classical tradition down to the 2018, 2019. Okay, for many, many generations, classics was in a sense a form of a way in which Western men and women for more than 2000 years trying to make sense of what they were living, in a sense. So it has to do a lot with the hermeneutics of meaning. What's the significance of our lives? What are we actually doing here? And so the classic anchoring on the classics is quite clear, has a lot to do with trying to make sense of what's happening. It's a form of, it's a heuristic discipline. And this is in the sense the way class was taught in grammar public schools at the beginning of the century. Okay, so you study classes because you kind of join the club of the meaning. You join the meaning. You understand the meaning. Certainly, that's what most of the workforce were doing at the beginning of the century. Okay, so I do strongly believe that what Smith is doing here is a little what Goethe would do when he was traveling to Rome at the beginning, in the late 18th century, beginning 19, or what would Ungaretti today will do at the beginning of the 20th. Trying to make sense of what they were living. Okay, so I think the anchoring of the classes has also to do with an existential crisis going on at the beginning of the century. The world is a change, the world has come, and we didn't somehow expect it to a certain extent, the world is changing. How do we make sense of it? So we use the classics also as a way to find a bit of certainty, in a sense, and there's something I think has to do with the meaning. That said, there is a cultural and a social dimension, very important, and but I think deep down, and to be honest, I do think that the crisis of the classics of the 21st century has a lot to do with the kind of cynicism towards these sort of questions. Okay? And discussing with a friend, and this is really existential issues not sort of for us at the moment. Okay, so should we continue to the classes the way we started for many centuries? Should we change it? And if so, to go where? Okay, and there are a lot of people with different strong views about it. Maybe there were no variations between the 20th century. So that leads okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I got a question for Mark. I don't know.
No, it's fine. It's for people. Okay. I'm not fine.
So you were speaking about the wind in Smith, and he mentions the wind many times, but he specifically mentions the west wind a lot. Do you think that has to do? It has that Tolkienian influence of land of the west, or perhaps something Celtic, or perhaps the west wind with the spring, or how do you interpret that?
Or perhaps something classical even.
Oh,
yeah. So there's a long-standing myth then of lands to the west, islands in the west. There's a poem which I didn't mention by Tolkien, the Blessed Mariners, and in that poem, again we have a tower, and someone is in the tower looking out into the sea and watching the Blessed Mariners traveling out into the west. It appears in the Stapleton magazine of Exeter College, Oxford in about 1920. It's obviously appropriate for the post-war that in the same issue, almost on the next page or the previous page, there's a poem about the blasted city of Ypres, Wipers Ypres. So, and the blessed mariners, who are they? Are they the souls of the soldiers sailing out into the west? There's this kind of myth that's there in various cultures, not just Celtic, not only classical Celtic. It's in the Brendan stories, and it's even suggested in Old English literature, and this is where Tolkien got his idea of undone, who also sails out into the west.
So you have, I think you're going to make a point and then the question.
Yeah, the point about this is just that the wind is mostly coming from the west. That's just a fact of how winds are. In this part of the world,
yes,
west wind is the common kind of wind. So if you write about wind, you are likely to write about west wind.
But it fits in with all the rest
yeah.
of the mythology. It's the ocean, isn't it, and the west wind. It's in all the folk songs as well, when the west wind blows.
Can we go to this gentleman here?
Small comment, and sometimes when you see the same tradition in many different mythological aspects, maybe sometimes you can think that it could have been even Indo-European tradition going even back further. But since we have no inscriptions, nothing to read about it, so we can never be sure. But I think sometimes we should always see the background behind those traditions, especially when you can find it everywhere in Indo-European people.
It is true. I mean, this kind of is not just found in Greek and Roman mythology, but it's Celtic. So I do think that it's always complex to dismantle the tower and to find the connection to different layers, because there are different layers of influence here, including what you were mentioning now, the archetypical pan-European. A former colleague of ours here in Oslo wrote a book on this, on pan-European mythology, and the idea of the underworld or the other world place in the West is already there, actually. There is something, again, let's remember that the Indo-European movement was towards the West. So it's a westward, there's a fairly westward in the European civilization takes back in game also.
Chris, do you have a point?
Yeah, a question for Beppe, actually. I was very intrigued by the idea you mentioned of possible classical influence in the Rebellion of the Noldor and Fëanor. I'm actually looking at that episode very closely right now, and I'm wondering, well, two things. What general classical influences you see, and specifically, do you see any quasi-Promethean elements in Fëanor specifically?
I mean, with the second one, it's easier because Prometheus is associated with two things in particular. First, with creativity. Prometheus is the great artist, the first archetypical artist. And second, with fire. Prometheus is the one who discovered fire. And if you think about Fëanor, the two main attributes of Fëanor is the creativity and the fire. I've always seen the Fëanor as a very Prometheus figure in respect of these two images in particular. In the thing of in the issue of the Noldor in general, okay, again, here the kind of the web of influence is very difficult to duplicate. Okay, here, of course, even the original scene, that's the first fall of the elves. So the way Tolkien also describes in the letter is a kind of archetypical fall, scene that to a certain extent was the limit fall. That's being kicked out to heaven, okay, that's what happens to the Noldor, okay, they choose it, okay, but at the same time, so I think it's a bit difficult, okay, to find out what for me looks like classical in that particular episode is indeed related to the myth of the Golden Age, so the 5-age myth of Hesiod. There is a moment in particular with the change of one generation to the other, which we do find also in the Genesis, with the Noah myth, Noah mythologies. At a certain point, human beings get so bad that they decide to go from one place to the other. There is a kind of a movement from one place to the other, which is kind of complemented by a movement to a different direction, which is the one of Noah. So I do think that, so thinking about the Bible, but it's not, we think about the Genesis, but also we think in the Davidic myth, but also the Noah myth, which is parallel in the Greek mythology as well, and also in Gilgamesh mythology. So he was possibly a myth which was not European, but was probably more of the Middle East. So I think the best kind of parallel we find there. With Prometheus is easier, okay? If you Prometheus with no connection commits, I don't think anyone has ever written this mythos, I don't think I've ever had anyone making the connection, but when I think about Prometheus, and also Prometheus is the one who addresses, is the speaker, the one who addresses the man, so he has great rhetorical skills. And in fact, and also, if you think about Prometheus, it's quite clear how Prometheus comes back again and again in Tolkien. There is another Prometheus scene. The song of Fëanor is attached to a rock. In the setting, there is an eagle coming to eat his liver. That's again Prometheus' story. So there is something very problematic in the whole family of Fëanor, not just Fëanor himself, but also the son of Fëanor.
One of the Silmarillion variants, I forgot which one, actually has the words, Fëanor was a great warrior. So it's very interesting to know the classical background of that.
If I'm not mistaken, I think there is a reference from Berlin Figure on connecting Prometheus and Fëanor, but I'm not sure exactly what it is, I have to look it up. But it's quite interesting because both Prometheus and Fëanor go against the will of the gods in a way, and they get punished for that. So we can find hubris as well in a way.
But also the thing that the creativity is very positive. Prometheus is the one who invents technology. So in the history of the Golden Age myths, all problems begin when technology began. So and also with sailing, that's the other thing that in the Golden Age myth of Hesiod, so in the Golden World, there will be no technology, and especially no sailing. Another point of the tool, which is 464, which is also kind of informed on the Hesiodic myth, they begins with the invasion of a god. And if you think about it, that's really what they do. They start sailing, and they sail east. This is basically, I do think that you can really see the Hesiodic answers to that field.
John?
Mind-blowing. But Morgoth, now, Tolkien has his habit of splitting one thing into two opposites. So we get Odin, Sauron, and Gandalf. So I think Martin Burns makes that point. So here, potentially Prometheus leading to Fëanor, who kind of borrows the light of the two trees, and Melkor, who steals it, right? And is also afflicted by eagles later on. I'm really intrigued by the point that was made earlier about the giant bodies of Arthur and Guinevere, and now we're talking about the Titans, and now we're talking about the biblical flood and so on, because prior to the flood there were giants in the earth in those days, and I'm convinced that Tolkien's thinking about this with regards to the Numenoreans too. And I had another point, but I've forgotten it.
Beppe, can I ask about, is there anything you could say about the theme of rebirth or cleansing as more as a purgative force, which is very common, which comes up in Smith, as I mentioned, but comes up in First World poetry quite a bit.
So you mean the question of you, anything classical about it?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Again, going back to the myth of the Golden Age, each age ends with a big war. So the typical trick used by the gods to pass from one generation to the other, they may get fighting with each other. Okay, so again, this is very, very classical as well. The war as a cleansing, there's really the idea, okay, the human beings have grown too much, okay, so in a sort of entropic idea, okay, how do we kind of get rid of them, or get rid of them that making them fight against each other, okay? And we find something similar in another very important myth in the Western tradition, which is the Babylon myth, the Tower of Babel myth. The Tower of Babel myth, which is to do with the separation of languages, which is again also very Tolkienian, because they have the whole idea of Quenya and the Sindar dividing up in different strands. If you read carefully the myth of the Tower of Babel, there is a titanomachy framework there, because you have the god who's a bit afraid of these human beings that are becoming so well organized that they can kind of get to the sky, and therefore they split the single language to different language, and they start fighting with each other because they don't understand each other any longer. So I think that again, something classical, especially the Hesiod version, but also something which maybe goes deeper than that.
Just remember my point.
Oh, yes, go on.
And this relates to things that you were talking about earlier, where did this idea of the Western place of wonder come from? So Tolkien seems to have been quite early on very interested in the work of Fridtjof Nansen, the book In Northern Mist, which was published in 1911, it was the beginning of what Nansen hoped would be a history of the discovery and exploration of the northern and western seas, but he never gets far beyond the discovery of the Americas in the first place, or only just gets there. So a lot of it is about the folklore, the half knowledge from very earliest times. And his argument is that there's a transmission from classical belief in the Fortunate Isles to the west, through to Celtic lore, and then from Celts to Iceland. And therefore, that when the Vikings sailed to the Americas and found Vinland, they actually talk about finding several places. One of them is Vinland, and his argument is that Vinland itself was an imaginary place that they never actually got to, because it has the tropes of one of these earthly paradises, you know, the vines that propagate by themselves, the wheat that's just waiting there to be harvested. So Tolkien owned that book from 1921. I think he encountered it earlier than that, probably when studying Vinland sagas under William Craigie in 1914 to 15. Just about early enough to have spoken to Smith about it, but maybe he knew it earlier. You know, it made quite a bit of noise when it was published in 1911. Lectures, newspapers, it was all over the place. I think it could have caught Tolkien's eye.
So we've got a follow-up point, and then I'll see if you have a reply, and I think we'll call it off. So yeah.
I just remember there's this Chinese word called Journey to the West, the legend of Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, and I'm absolutely ignorant of the subject, so but I'm not sure if did Tolkien read this and might it have some form of influence in what we're discussing about the winds in the north and journey to the west. Because there's also this idea of the blessed realm to the west, and there is a sense of by going there, there's some sort of redemption and re-achieving mortality. But it's like I'm fully aware that it's an entirely different culture. But I don't know if
What's the name of this text?
Journey to the West.
Journey to the West.
We know he had Japanese prints in his student rooms. I think we know that. But I don't know that. The Chinese journey to the West.
Any final comments from Mark or Beppe?
Can I say one final comment from Mark? Yes, I think there's an episode of the novel that needs to be mentioned, which is Frodo's Dream. Frodo's Dream is in the sense it's quite clearly recalling the allegory that you would most prepare for, because it's very literary if you want. Frodo is hearing the voice of the sea, and then he says to climb up over a tower. So yes. The team of tower, the team of wind. And as we know in Tolkien, the dream imagery has a very literary implication, of course. Like the dreams of the Valar, for instance, at the beginning, are the actual the war is described either in the very early drafts of the Silmarillion is the dream of the Valar, or in the Northern Cloud papers. I mean, these are people who see dreams, linguistic dreams that they then reconstruct as being the history of Numenor. So I think that there is a kind of interesting link connection between the image of the tower, the image of the sea, and the image of the dream.
Yes, definitely. And the language is picked up again at the very end of the novel, isn't it? As they sail.
Yes, sailing west, in fact.
They're kind of sailing west at the end of the northern routes.
Well, we're not going to quite sail west. We're going to go out and have a cup of tea. So this is near as done it. So thank you very much for Beppe.